This was the main report that we published from the inquiry, and this is just a little bit of promo, but I want to draw your attention to the fact that on the inquiry's website, on the NIAS website, there are a whole number of papers dealing with other issues that you can freely download, including the thematic paper that we're talking about today. It includes the summary that you have in your packs, but there are a range of other issues there. I won't run through all those, but any of you who are interested in some of the other themes down the left or the sectoral analysis, please just go on the website and have a look. There is a lot of material there. Right, so let's turn particularly, again, this audience needs no emphasis, but it is a stunning fact of the disparity between the educational levels of the prison population and the rest of the population. And it is something of an indictment, not only actually of the education system, but of the way in which we bring up our young people, that so many of them do fail badly. And these are huge gaps in the qualification levels and the attitudes and values towards school and education that are shown by these figures. Right, so that's all background familiar to you anyway. Let me just say something about this triangle here. It looks a very abstract and academic triangle. It comes from work that I did with my colleague John Bunner, who'll be talking to you later, when we were co-directors of the Research Centre on the Wider Benefits of Learning. Let me just talk you briefly through this triangle, because particularly in these days and the experience of the last few years where so much of the education system generally has been focused on qualifications and on narrow interpretations of skill, this, I hope, is a framework that reminds us that there are wider factors at play. So human capital refers broadly to those sort of economic aspects of education in the sense of qualifications and skills that are developed, largely at an individual level. Very important, but not the only part of the story. Identity capital, a slightly fancy term, broadly a psychological notion to do with self-esteem, people's image of themselves. And the point here, you all know it well, is that where there are low levels of self-esteem and poor images of self, people are much less likely to be successful in the learning that they undertake and much less likely to be able to use any of that learning in the outside world. And therefore, any educational project or policy, not just for offenders but more widely, needs to pay considerable attention to these aspects of confidence and belief in oneself. I don't know how many of you were involved in any of the Adult Learners Week celebrations that took place last week. But again and again, the single most consistent message that emerges when you talk to that incredible range of adult learners is the way in which involvement in learning has improved their self-esteem and enabled them to do things that they never believed they would have done. Social capital complements these other two forms. That is about the networks that people take part in and the values that they share with other people around them. If you belong to a network that believes in education, believes in the value of learning, and believes in a whole host of other positive things, you will be much more likely to succeed, both in your learning and in what goes on elsewhere. And moreover, the success that you have, this is the virtuous spiral, if you like, the success that you have will lead you into networks that, again, are going to support you, give you access to employment, and a host of other opportunities. And I'll come back to that slightly, briefly later on. So that's a framework that looks rather academic and abstract, but I hope I can convince you that it's a useful way of thinking about the kinds of educational enterprise that you and I am engaged in. Okay, let me turn just briefly to the argument about, I don't like the term cost-benefit particularly. We use the term public value of lifelong learning. Why do I do that? In part, it's an instrumental approach, but I think we're at a point now where the time is right for a really new debate about prisons and what we do in prisons. And part of that debate is going to be about calculations on what prison does and doesn't do, and the effectiveness or otherwise of policies such as offender learning. And what we've tried to do in the inquiry in this area, as in several other areas, is produce some simple, reasonable calculations about the value of learning. And I emphasize reason. It is important, I think, not to overclaim for what education and learning can do on its own. And I guess particularly in this area of crime. Education is not a silver bullet. If prisoners do not leave prison and find accommodation, then really all the learning that they do, and you may remember, Pat, may even be you who made this point, but it certainly stuck with me at the seminar that we ran around crime as part of the inquiry, was a very forceful statement that if within 3 or 4 weeks of offenders leaving prison, they haven't found accommodation and either some form of employment or a training course, then all the learning that's gone on in prison just disappears. You might as well tear it up and throw it in the bin. I mean, that was a fairly extreme way of putting it, but it is important. So accommodation and jobs, of course, are crucial. But if we're going to make the argument about the importance of learning, we need to run through some forms of argumentation. So we know there are huge costs of prison. We know that reoffending, and these are fairly well established figures, is round about 11 or 12 billion. I think less well known, I guess probably you will know this, but I must say when I've talked about this in the past, these two statistics I'm just going to show now are ones that the wider public really have very little appreciation of. First of all, 150,000 children have a parent in prison. And then when you tie that to this, which I must say was a really dramatic figure, which came at a talk given at a parliamentary reception, that 2 out of 3 boys who have a father in prison will go to prison themselves. Now, it's not just a shocking statistic in itself, it's also a basis for a positive argument about investing in offender learning. If we want the next generation to do better, then investing in offender learning really makes very strong sense. Okay, so this is just briefly the type of calculation that we went through, and this is, as I say, it's an instrumental basis, but nevertheless useful. There's the annual cost per prisoner, reoffending costs just given you. If you make an assumption, and as I say, these are modest assumptions, that participation in learning, for whatever reason, reduces the likelihood of people returning to prison, we make 2 different assumptions, by 2% or by 5%. What's the effect of that? Okay, it doesn't reduce all the prison costs. The cells are still going to be there, the staff are still going to be there. So so we've halved, if you like, the impact of that effect.